Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, filling in for Riz Khan. Have human rights become a tool Western powers use as an excuse to pressure the developing world? Poorer countries often have fingers pointed at them whenever the West is unhappy with other unrelated issues. Some 60 years ago, the UN General Assembly passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a set of principles intended to provide an international standard for the rights of individuals everywhere. Initially, they were adopted as a response to the atrocities of World War II, as governments were looking for a way to hold leaders and individuals to a higher standard. Today, glaring human rights abuses around the world and an ever-increasing economic gap between Western and developing nations calls into question the effectiveness of the declaration. With more than 1 billion people going hungry and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan taking the lives of thousands, some analysts question the relevance of human rights as a concept. Today we ask, are human rights standards achieving their intended aim, or have they become a tool used for political and economic gain? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and of course we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me now from London is Kostas Douzinas. He's the author of The End of Human Rights and Human Rights and Empire. Professor Douzinas also directs the Burbach Institute for the Humanities at the University of London. Here in Washington, I'm joined by Ian Levine, Director of Programs for Human Rights Watch. Previously, he served as Amnesty International's representative to the United Nations and UNICEF's Chief of Humanitarian Policy. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Professor Douzinas, I want to start with you. You believe that human rights has become a tool for governments, you've written extensively about this, to gain power, to gain wealth, and to make political gains. I'm wondering if you could explain that for us a bit more.
Oh, thank you very much. The purpose of human rights, I believe, is to resist public and private domination and oppression. They represent, I think, an eternal human urge. If there is anything eternal about human rights, it's precisely the urge to resist, to dissent, to try and fight for a better world. And that was the aim of human rights or natural rights in the 18th century with the great revolutions, the French, the American, and their declarations. That was to a certain extent the aim in 1948 when the Universal Declaration was introduced. But in the last 30 years, things have changed, and we can identify three major changes. The first is this. In our recent humanitarian wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, earlier in Kosovo and Serbia and elsewhere, we go into parts of the world to save humanity, and to do that we kill humans. And indeed we kill more humans than would have been the case had we not been there. So while initially they were a tool of resistance against governments, now they have become part of the armory that governments have and use around the world. The second problem is economic. You did mention at the beginning this huge gap, the bottom billion, a billion people going hungry every day. The fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, the life expectancy is in the low 40s, while in Northern Europe it is in the 90s. That inequality, that huge gap between the North and the South and between the rich and the poor in the North is again something recent. It did coincide with the so-called triumph of human rights. Now, is there a direct link between that huge and growing chasm, this huge gap between the North and the South, and the supposed triumph of human rights? Some people would say that there is. What I would say is that there is a clear temporal coincidence. The two things happen together. And there is no doubt that a certain conception of human rights that emphasizes individuals and emphasizes property rights, and it is being used by transnational companies all over the world in order to protect their own interests against governments that try to carry out an element of redistribution. There is no doubt that this type of interpretation of human rights and practice of human rights indeed has linked human rights with that wider project of neoliberal capitalism, the Washington Consensus, and so on. So we need, and people are doing it, we need to take human rights back. It belongs to us, to the people. It belongs to those who want to resist and dissent and have a better world.
Okay, let me go to Ian Levine here in the studio. Ian, You work for Human Rights Watch. It's an organization that's been at the forefront of monitoring human rights around the world. Have you found that in the last 30 years that violations of human rights have got worse?
We certainly know more about human rights violations now than we did 30 years ago, partly because of the communications revolution, which allows us to know what's going on in the world in ways that were inconceivable before cable TV and the internet, and partly because the development of international human rights standards since the Universal Declaration 61 years ago means that a lot more people understand their rights, know about their rights, and thanks to a very growing human rights movement at national level throughout the world, people feel empowered to claim those rights. So whether there are more violations or just that we know more about them is difficult to say. My feeling is that we probably know a lot more than we did, and that's why we see them. And in some ways, that obviously represents a success for the human rights movement. We've been able to take human rights from the corridors of the UN and help make them part of the vocabulary of people throughout the world.
And when you look at the observance of human rights around the world, do you find that some areas there are countries which are more egregious violators of human rights than others, or is it pretty universal at this stage?
There is no government in the world that respects all its human rights obligations, and as the professor pointed out, many governments do use the language of human rights in a way to justify actions that in fact are not at all human rights friendly. And one of the, I think, challenges for the human rights movement, for groups like mine and for national human rights groups throughout the world, is to call governments when they abuse the language of human rights. In terms of egregiousness of rights violations, I mean, clearly some countries stand out as being particularly egregious. Burma, Iran, Zimbabwe, Congo, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. One can mention a whole series of countries where we're particularly concerned not only about the level of human rights violations, but about a real backlash against the human rights movement. And we've been seeing in a number of countries around the world attacks on human rights activists, human rights defenders, journalists who write about human rights violations, and new laws and regulations to restrict the actions of human rights organizations.
Professor, you mentioned earlier the wars in Iraq. Go ahead, you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I wanted to say something in relation to what Mr. Levin said, a very important point he made at the end of his intervention. There is indeed, it's absolutely true to say that there has been over the last few years a certain reaction against both international organizations, including the United Nations. We had the terrible events in Baghdad, of course, with De Mello and the United Nations human rights people there, but also, you know, with NGOs and international NGOs. And I think that part of the explanation for this is a crucial paradox at the heart of our ideology and the way that we in the West present ourselves to the world. On the one hand, we're telling people that we're all free and equal, and that we all have the same dignity, the same personality, the same moral standing in the world. And this is very much part of the human rights tradition, and we're much better for it. But at the same time, we help spread and penetrate countries and economic systems with a totally disastrous economic approach to the world, the Washington consensus, neoliberal capitalism, which leads precisely to the opposite, which leads to what people now call, you know, the human debris, the human waste, the bottom billion. And you have this contradiction. If you're telling people that you are all equal because you are humans, peoples and countries and nations are equal again because, you know, we have these conventions and treaties. And at the same time, you are developing and promoting an economic system that creates huge inequality, that paradox could be seen and has been seen by people who, I'm reminded that when Napoleon was visiting Spanish prisoners of war, he was being met by huge banners which said "Down with freedom," because Napoleon was supposed to spread reason and freedom and modernity to the world. And this is what is happening today.
Okay.
We are being met.
I want to go to our viewers. We have a caller, Tanya, is calling from Iraq. Tanya, go ahead with your call.
Hi, good evening, and my regards to your guests. However, I just would like to make a comment to them. When they do speak about human rights and human rights being used as an excuse for colonization, well, I'd just like to say that here in Iraq, human rights and the Human Rights Charter was something that we actually aspired for all the atrocities and all the injustices that we faced under Saddam Hussein, especially we as Kurdish people, where we were murdered, we were gassed, we were put in mass graves. And now this, the Human Rights Charter is something that we kept on talking about, and it was our constitution for freedom. It was the reason what kept us going and saying that we have a right to be free, we have a right to life, we have a right to be equal, we have a right to be first-class citizens. It is unfortunate to see people who talk about human rights and saying that, human rights being used by Western countries in order to colonize them, or to say that, Iraq is, or people in Iraq are much worse off now than they were before. I truly think that this is a misrepresentation of everything that has happened in Iraq before 2003, and we do have to remember that before 2003, media was not free in Iraq. A lot of the atrocities were not talked about. Now that we do have a new government in place, and now we do have a new elected parliament, it is quite we tend to be quite open about everything that is happening, which is why it is unfortunate. Some people now may say that Iraqis are worse off than they were before.
All right, thanks, Tanya. Thanks for your call. Ian Levine, the caller there from Iraq, talking about how human rights has changed in Iraq with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Has it changed? Because there's some groups in Iraq who'd say, no, it hasn't changed.
Well, certainly we're seeing different kinds of human rights problems perhaps than we saw before. Clearly under Saddam Hussein we saw an extremely repressive and oppressive regime, and a regime that in particular dramatically and egregiously violated the rights of certain parts of the population, particularly the Kurds, as we know. What we've seen now since the American-led invasion of 2003 has been obviously a lot more violence, including violence committed by kind of militia groups which the government is only partially able to control, if at all. We're seeing perhaps small steps now towards stability, but still a country racked by violence. So many problems still remaining and much work to be done.
Okay, we have to take a short break right now. More of our discussion in a moment. We'll be right back.